Hello and welcome to the World Wanderers podcast, your source for travel stories, travel destinations, and travel philosophy.
I'm Amanda.
I'm Ryan.
And we're your hosts.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the podcast. We both hope that you are doing well and staying safe and that everything is going well for you wherever in the world you might be. I know a lot of people are hunkered down wherever they were when all of this stuff started. So I hope you're staying safe. I hope you're making the best out of a very hard situation. This week on the podcast, we are excited to share an interview we did with Lee Jamison. Lee is an author who has a number of books that are guides to specific Latin American Spanish. We actually found Lee through his book on Panamanian Spanish. I was Googling, looking for some resources to understand better how Panamanians use the language. I found his book, and diving in, it was really interesting, exactly what I was looking for, and I became more and more interested in Lee's story. And so we were excited to get him on the podcast. He has spent decades living in Latin America in a number of different countries, and we talk about that, what brought him to the region, and really focus in on language learning. What ignited his interest in speaking Spanish, and how he's gone beyond just the classroom typical correct grammar to really try to understand the way people speak the language, and then what motivated him to turn that into books and his different gringo guides that he's created. And if you're learning the language, Spanish can be tricky because it's really, really great on one hand that so many countries speak it, but it's challenging because every country and every region has a unique flair to it. And we've both gotten so much of diving into the language where we speak. We don't think about it like, oh, we're not going to focus too much on Panamanian Spanish because we spend lots of time in other countries. We're all in trying to learn, understand, and speak like a Panamanian. And then when we go to Mexico, we try to speak like a Mexican, and really encourage you to do the same. I think you're really going to enjoy this interview about learning Spanish and adventures in Latin America with Lee Jamison.
And before we get started with this episode of the podcast with Lee, we just wanted to give a quick little shout out to our favorite language school in Panama City, Casco Antiguo Spanish School. When we decided that we wanted to spend a number of months in Panama City, we knew that we wanted to have an in-person experience of taking language lessons. And Casco Antiguo Spanish School is located in the coolest area in Panama City, in Casco Antiguo. It's the old part of the city, and they have both one-on-one or small group classes, which allow you to get out of the classroom and learn Spanish in real-life settings. For us, we did private one-on-one lessons for a number of weeks, and we saw our Spanish skills go up immensely just in a couple of weeks of having these classes. The school also offers free social activities every day, such as sunset bike tours, salsa dancing, happy hour, and beach volleyball. The school is located in the heart of this incredible colonial neighborhood that's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So for us, we had the opportunity to go twice a week to a different neighborhood than we lived in the city and be able to stay after and check it out. They have the best sunsets over in Casco, as well as lots of places to eat and drink if you want to stay after or come before your Spanish lessons. The school has a great social atmosphere and the teachers are incredible. When we were there, we had the chance to work with two different Spanish teachers and both gave us a really unique experience. One of the best parts about Casco Antiguo Spanish School is that they also offer classes online via Skype or Zoom. So although we're back in Canada right now, we're still continuing our Spanish lessons with the same teacher at the same time. If you're listening to this in real time, then you know we are currently in full-on pandemic mode right now, and having our Spanish lessons every single week with the teacher we were working with while we're in Panama City is giving us a real sense of routine in our day. And also, if you are looking for the opportunity to use the time that you have to learn a language, Casco Antiguo Spanish School is definitely a place that we would recommend. If you're interested in getting started with online lessons ASAP, you can head on over to cascospanish.com and check out one of their packages. All right, now on to the interview with Lee.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lee.
No, it's good to be here, Ryan and Amanda.
And so the first thing we're curious about is where in the world are you joining us from?
Believe it or not, right outside of Greenville, South Carolina. We're in the States just for a few months. And so it's a rainy day here in Greenville today.
Yeah, we actually spent some of November and December in Charleston I guess, at the end of 2018. And we were really, I guess, as Canadians, when you go to the southern US, you kind of think like, winter? They don't have winter down there. We were actually like reasonably like chilled the entire time we were there. So we can relate to that feeling of those rainy
True.
days in South Carolina.
Just in the month since we've been here, we've actually seen it snow 3 times. So I'm kind of shocked that the snow comes this far south. But yes, definitely.
Yeah, it's like there's south in the name. Someone's messed up somewhere. And so Lee, Amanda and I are actually based in Panama, and we've been here for a few months. And one of the first things when we get to a new country, we spend quite a bit of time in Mexico. And so coming to Panama, we were like, okay, we need to learn a bit more about Panamanian Spanish. And I was actually searching on Amazon, I think, and I came across your book, The Gringo Guide 200 to Panamanian Spanish. And then we're actually as well taking Spanish classes here in Panama. And so it was a fun experience of kind of going through that process of like reading your book, getting all these like slang words and then being able to like show them off with some of the Panamanians who work there, who all have like confirmed basically like everything that was in there. I went through the book and was like sharing some of the words, and they're like, yeah, people say that here. And so it was a really, really cool resource. And I saw that you had one for Guatemala, one for Nicaragua, one for Costa Rica. And it made me think like, okay, this guy is someone we should get on the podcast. And so that's a really elaborate preamble. But I guess the first question would be, how did you get interested in Spanish and in particularly Latin American Spanish?
Good question, Ryan. Actually, it's strange how I stumbled upon Spanish. It goes all the way back to when I was in middle school. I remember between 8th and 9th grade, you always have a conference with the guidance counselors. And I wasn't going to take Spanish the following year. I heard that the Spanish teacher wasn't very good. But the guidance counselors practically twisted my arm and said, no, you're good with languages. You would do well in this. So reluctantly, I accepted. But it turned out that I loved it. The teacher was actually quite good. And I think what happens to a lot of young people who study in high school a language or even in college, they're just doing it for credit. And very few go beyond just the basics of vocabulary and get to the point that they can actually speak or converse with others. But back at this time, I was living in Ohio, and there was practically zero Latin population at the time. But suddenly, 2 girls from Honduras showed up in our town, and suddenly I was in class with them, and they were totally lost in English. So in an effort just to help them with their homework, I really started to force myself to go beyond the books and into conversational Spanish. So then later on in my senior year, we had a fellow from Spain who was an exchange student, and it was the same with him. He could barely speak a lick of English, so I would start to talk with him. So that's kind of how my journey in Spanish got started.
Yeah, it's so interesting, hey, how it's like you need that context. I think Amanda and I both actually took Spanish in high school in Canada. And, if you can imagine going from like the Midwest up to Canada, there's even less like that context for people who actually speak Spanish. And it's more of just this thing that you feel like you need to do. And it really kind of makes you like detached from it. And so for us, our story was learning a bit of Spanish in high school and then actually going to Spain after college and having this experience of like, oh, wow, you can actually like, use this stuff to do stuff. And I think that really turned on our motivation level.
Exactly. And sometime thereafter, I actually started to volunteer in New York City. I was doing an educational work there, ended up working with the Latin American community. And in New York City, of course, there's over 1 million Spanish speakers, but most are Caribbeans, people from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Cuba. And probably one of the worst Spanishes you could ever experience in your life, because it's very common in those countries. They cut off all the word endings when they're talking. They speak very fast. So suddenly I was really thrust into a world where I had to converse and have to ask a lot of questions. And so I think that in a way was also helpful, because you realize that to really learn a language well, you have to put yourself out on the line. You cannot feel any embarrassment about making mistakes or anything like that. You just have to let it out there, jump in the water and the people will help you.
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard that Puerto Rican Spanish is like one of the hardest to understand. We actually have a friend here in Panama she's Panamanian, so she's a native Spanish speaker, and her husband's actually Puerto Rican, and she's like, sometimes I don't even know what he's saying. Like, don't feel bad. She's like, I've been speaking this language my whole life, and I'm totally fluent. So it is really interesting to, just as you dive into learning a language, you get these like I think little wins where, you have a conversation with somebody or you successfully order a meal and then you successfully get a bus ticket or you negotiate something. And then you have these moments where like you don't understand anything and you're like, okay, I guess I don't speak any Spanish. And I feel like as an adult, they really can like hit your ego a little bit. And I think that's kind of, what you're saying where you have to just be a little bit like fearless and not worry about it and not worry about sounding stupid, or you're going to miss those opportunities to have that practice with local people.
No, it's true. You think even about the language we speak, English, for most people in the world, it's a very difficult language to learn and to learn how to speak well because we don't have a very phonetic pronunciation system. And yet as children, we learned it without studying books or grammar. We just started rattling off, even though we were babbling, but that's just how we humans learn languages. So even as adults, we have to try to recreate that process. The more you speak it, regardless of how many mistakes you make, the faster you're going to get fluent in any Spanish that you decide to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned that you had gone to New York. Eventually, you ended up moving to Latin America, right?
That's right. So in 1995, my wife and I actually got married in North Carolina around Raleigh. And then we had an opportunity to do some missionary work in Central America. We ended up going to Nicaragua. So it was an amazing experience. At that time, Nicaragua was still in shambles in many ways, because you'll remember in the 1980s, there was a civil war there. But we found the people to be so kind, so friendly. But immediately when we get off the plane, even though we thought we were fluent Spanish speakers, we realized that the locals had so many words and phrases that we had never heard of before. And so it's almost as if every time a word like that would come up, it was a red flag. And I was never bashful about saying, hey, what does that mean? I remember one thing they used to say a lot in Nicaragua, which was very helpful actually. We were unloading a container one day of donations that had arrived. And somebody said, hey, pásame ese chunche. And this word chunche I'd never heard before. I was saying, pass me the chunche. And it turns out it is just an all throw-in word, basically the whatchamacallit. So once I learned that, I was set because I didn't have to learn so much vocabulary. I knew that I could just say chunche and I could point to the object I wanted and I was on my way.
I love that. I feel like it's so perfect because in English we use like thing for so much stuff, which I feel like I use cosa a lot in Spanish, but my language teacher is always like, we don't really say things like that. So I love that in Nicaragua, they have a specific word for that. I feel like that would be really good for my Spanish vocabulary.
Oh, exactly. It simplifies the amount of things you need to learn right off the bat. And, the locals, when they hear those words that are part of their country's vocabulary, it just opens them up so much more to you. I think it helps you to go beyond being just a visitor to being like part of their community, part of their family.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think especially, any type of trying to speak that local language, I think is a really great way to connect yourself with a different country. But I think that if you can, especially learn some of those slang words or some of the words that are specific to these different Latin American countries, it shows that you've gone out and made some effort to learn a little bit more about their dialect of the language, which is, I think, like you said, a great way to start a conversation, because I'm sure a local is going to be like, wait, why do you know this word? How do you know that?
Oh, they're thrilled. They're just very tickled when they hear a foreigner using the words that only they know, because even if they're in a meeting with other Latin Americans, I mean, very quickly, their choice of vocabulary gives them away as to what country they're from Or they can even tell when another Latin comes, it isn't from Panama or isn't from a certain country by certain words they say. It's just like an alarm that goes off in their head. So when you make that effort and go the extra mile, it really makes a difference in interpersonal relationships.
Mm-hmm. And so how long did you end up spending in Nicaragua?
Well, in the end, it was 17 years.
Wow.
So we actually felt after that time that we were practically Nicaraguan. Because then when we moved to Nicaragua from Mexico, it was like almost a culture shock to us, even though it was still the Spanish-speaking world, but it was completely different. So you really do, after many years in another country, you start to identify yourself, I think, more with that culture than even your very own.
Yeah, for sure. And did you guys have sort of that feeling of like, Nicaragua was home? And with that, did you feel it like kind of right away, or was it something that over time you felt more and more like, okay, this feels like home to us?
I think definitely the first year or two, you're still adapting to so many different things, changes in climate and culture and the language itself. But I think after 2 to 3 years, you start to feel like you belong there. And then after over a decade, and you know so many people, they really become like your family. So no, definitely it is. And I think my wife and I, now that we're back in the States for a little while, we almost feel a reverse culture shock. Just going to grocery stores and being shocked at how much prices are when you're used to buying at some local market in Latin America, or sometimes pleasant shocks that gasoline here is half the price of what we're paying in Mexico. So it's amazing how, as humans, we really adapt to our surroundings, regardless of where we are.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely something, maybe on a different level, but something that we can relate to. I mean, just even spending, like a couple years in Latin America with these breaks where we go back to Canada. There's so many things that I love about Canadian culture and things that I really enjoy while I'm there. And then there's these other things that just feel, it's like you go back and you really get to see these things about your native culture that you like never really realized, I guess. Like, for example, for me, I found, not the last time I went back to Canada, but when we went back after we were living in Mexico for a year, I was kind of shocked by like how passive the culture is in the way that we communicate things. Because I feel like in Latin America in general, but specifically in Mexico, like they're very to the point. This is what I need. And we'd gotten used to that. It was uncomfortable for us at first, but then it's like, you're the weird one when you go back to Canada and you're like, I just want this thing.
It's true. We change. And being in other countries, we change. And then when we go back, now we have to change again to fit back where we came from in the first place. It's a weird phenomenon.
And so in Nicaragua, were you guys doing missionary work the whole time?
We were. It was varied. We have a lot of conversations with people, but on occasions, I remember when we were there, Hurricane Mitch hit toward the end of the 90s out there toward Chinandega. So we helped in the relief work that was there, some construction work, some translation work as well. They have native languages there like Miskito, Mayagna, and Nicaraguan Sign Language. So we also worked on projects with those languages while we were there.
Oh, that's really cool. And so I'm curious, when did the idea to write a book come from? I'm assuming that the Nicaraguan Spanish was the first one. And if so, like what was the process like of going from like that light bulb to actually having that book in your hands?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it was that probably toward, I don't know when it started, probably around the mid 2010s, that publishing on demand became more common. Before that, unless you were associated with some publishing house, it would probably be very difficult to get started in publishing a book. So that opened the idea. But really, I just became a fan of learning the local sayings, the local words. It almost became my reputation. So I had several friends, and even my wife, they would constantly tell me, you should write a book, you should write a book. So finally, in 2012, my father-in-law died that year. So while we were back in the States, it finally clicked on me. It's like, okay, this is the perfect time. We're going to be here for 2 or 3 months and taking care of matters. So we just started doing it. And I thought this was an idea that, writing you can do anywhere in the world, which makes it a little bit different from other kinds of work you might do. So we started doing it. I wanted to do something that was a little more directed instead of just a dictionary. Because my problem with dictionaries is how do you know which words there are really used often or common with the people and which words are not? It's very all-inclusive. So I decided on 200 as a base, and to find the words that I personally had learned, that I saw that were useful, and then share that with the community. So that's kind of how I fell into it, really.
Yeah. And how do you go about picking those words? Like, I mean, imagine with, like you have a lot of experience with like hearing them, but what was that like in terms of like creating a big spreadsheet and being like, okay, these are definitely the ones I want to include?
Exactly. You'd start off with that spreadsheet, and I would try to also give it a category so that you can learn about different terms, maybe terms that have to do with the family, terms that have to do with work, terms about the bright side, good things in life, terms about the negative things in life. So I kind of organize them into those categories. And I also do some field testing before I release them. I'll have several Nicaraguans who also understand English to read it over, get their feedback, do changes before that goes along. But I mean, having lived there for so many years, you kind of, as you're working on one word, it would make you remember another one or something else that was related to it. So in a way, you're making kind of a mind map of a general idea and then expanding it out into more specific thoughts and terms, but all related to the same category, you could say.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. And so I'm curious kind of like the process with all of these books. So you started with Nicaragua, and then how did it kind of go from there that you were able to release all these other books and create these I guess like resources for other people to learn the informal parts of the language?
Great question. What happened is in 2012, we were reassigned to Mexico. We started living just outside of Mexico City. But our organization where we were working actually had merged all the offices from Central America into one regional office outside of Mexico City. So suddenly, my workmates were people from all these countries. So I was working with people from Guatemala, Costa Rica, Panama. And while we lived in Nicaragua, we had also visited Panama and Costa Rica on occasion. They're just so close. So once I had the basic method for doing it with Nicaraguan Spanish, then it's like they say about languages. Once you learn one, it's easier to learn another one. And I think the same applies to books. So once you've written one book and saw the process that went into it, then it was easier, I think, to repeat it for other books. And now we have, I guess, the advantage of the internet, which there's so many articles on there about Panamanian Spanish, Guatemalan Spanish. So I would start there from a point. I actually found Twitter to be a good source of information because you can do a search in Twitter and search only within a certain region. And I think when people are tweeting, they're more likely to use slang or conversational speech than in something written in a newspaper. Another good source of material on local newspapers are not the articles themselves sometimes, but many times in comments that people write in underneath, you get the real local flavor of Spanish. So there is where I've also found some nice local examples of how they're using these slang terms and idioms.
Yeah, yeah. I think I know I think it's one of like the amazing things of being alive right now in this time. Like, I mean, there's so many good things about it, like being able to work from wherever you want in the world and being able to travel to places to learn a language. But I think for us, especially, like we're able to watch TV shows on Netflix that are like Mexican TV shows, or we're able to, find translations of every book in Spanish on our Kindles. We're able to go on Twitter, and both of us have been able to like follow a bunch of Panamanian and Latin American creators on different social media platforms. So you can kind of just like always be exposed to this language, even if you're not like actively in that place.
Exactly. It's opened up the world even more. And I think what I've tried to do in these books is just organize that information a little bit into something that could be a little bit more useful. But I think people have to realize that they're more about getting deeper into the local language and understanding more the local people and culture. It's not about learning how to say hola or como está. I mean, there's tons of books on those subjects, but this is to really get. One woman wrote on one of her reviews of, I think it was the Guatemalan Spanish book, he says, "This book makes me feel like an insider." So that was also kind of the goal with these things, to get to be an insider into the Spanish world that each country has.
Yeah, I think that's like something that it's really. I mean, there's a couple of different like thoughts and directions I have with it. I think it's something we've really encountered a lot here too, in our travels, especially when you kind of interact with, it's tough with something like Spanish in some ways because it's all like technically the same language, but language really is just this abstract concept. It's not like the fact that they technically speak Spanish doesn't really mean that if you learn Spanish, you can understand what people are talking about in Argentina and understand what people are talking about in Mexico. You're going to have a lot of bumps in the road if you're just thinking you can speak Spanish in those places. But it does make it kind of like advantageous. But in some ways, I think it almost makes us feel like, oh, I'm going to learn Spanish and it's going to be so useful because I can use it in all of these countries. But then, for example, like Amanda and I just went and spent a week in Colombia, and we show up in Colombia and we're like, I don't know what anybody's talking about anymore, because like the accent, we were in Barranquilla, like the Caribbean part of Colombia, and the accent's actually not too different than Panama, but like the rhythm and the pace people are speaking at's really different, and the word choice is like completely different. And so you get in these situations where you're like you might have just mumbled at me, like I have no idea what you just said. And it kind of, you deal with this thing of like, I know how to speak Spanish, like why aren't you speaking it right? And then you're like, okay, no, they're speaking their language, our goal is to connect with them. We have to realize that some of the ways we think about this are just wrong.
Definitely. I mean, the same thing happened. I remember when we moved from Nicaragua to Mexico. Here I'm using these Nicaraguan sayings, and people were looking at me, like I came from another planet, because many of them were totally unknown to the Mexican population. And then you have the other problem that some words that are completely neutral in one country could be highly offensive in another. So that's another minefield that you have to walk through when you're going from one Spanish country to another. I'm thinking of a Mexican word. There's a Mexican word that starts with the CH that's like practically the F word in that language. But in Nicaraguan Panama, they have variations of this that have nothing at all to do with it. For example, there in Panama, they use the word chinguear, but it only means to gamble. It's just an everyday word. There's absolutely no vulgarity to it. Or in Nicaragua, they like to have drinks that are based on corn. But before you finish drinking it, there forms a sediment at the bottom of your glass. And Nicaraguans call that the chingaste. It's like the leftovers that are there. And of course, these words to a Mexican Spanish speaker would be highly offensive. But when you get to these countries, there's nothing at all wrong with them. So I think that's also another key to fitting in and not unnecessarily even offending someone when you're going from country to country.
Yeah, that's definitely something I experienced. I have a language teacher on italki who's Mexican, and I specifically hired somebody from Mexico so I could learn, the accent and these types of slang. And he corrected me with a couple things, not that one specifically, but like coger is an example where it's like, I'd been taught in school, like we use coger to take, and they use that as a not to take in Mexico. And so it's kind of like, oh, right, like I don't use this verb here. And then, you go to some other Latin American countries and they're like, why are you using tomar as like with taxis and stuff? So yeah, we've definitely had almost the opposite. Like we've spent a lot of time in Mexico, and getting to Panama was like, okay, we need to figure out the things in Panama that we shouldn't be saying and the things we should say, and how to switch our language up so that we're not, one, being offensive, and two, just kind of looking stupid in a not great way. Because I think there is the difference between like making a mistake with your conjugation and not letting your kind of like ego get in the way, and then also just saying something that somebody's like, that's really not correct.
Exactly. I think between the United States and Canada, since they're very developed countries, we've probably been watching a lot of the same television shows over decades of time. There's not so much of perhaps a difference between Canadian English and American English. But in these Latin countries, we have to remember, before the advent of the internet, there wasn't a lot of traveling of locals between these countries. So over time, they just developed such different vocabularies. One example of that always comes to my mind is the word that a country will use if you're light-skinned. So in Mexico, if you're light-skinned, they'll call you a güero or a güera if you're female. But if you're in the northern part of Central America, like El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras, they call you chele. So when I would go to the market in Nicaragua, they'd say, ¿Qué quiere, chelito? What do you want, whitey? But then you go to Costa Rica, and they use the word macho or machillo. Normally, it would mean being masculine, right? Or a macho man. But for them, it just means someone who's light-skinned. And there it also includes the idea of having blonde hair. Then you go to Panama, and they call people with light skin fulos or fulas. So, I mean, just look at that one example. Just in a region from Mexico to Panama, the variety is unreal.
Yeah, and just going back a second, talking about those dialects and how, as travelers, it can sometimes be like maybe easy to overlook them, or like you don't really invest in them as much. But I think it is really helpful for like learning the history of countries too. I know here for Panama, for example, there's a lot of words that come out of like the American influence and the American occupation of the Canal Zone that like have influenced the way people talk here now. And so, for example, like the word for quarter is like quota, or there's camaron. It's like, actually people think it's like Cameron, but it's actually come around, and it's the word for kind of a handyman because those people who used to like come around to get work in the Canal Zone. And so it's like just by diving in and like understanding a bit of the way people speak and a bit of the local dialect, you kind of like opens your eyes and your mind a bit to like the history of that area as well.
Oh, definitely. I remember just outside of Panama City, they even have that city called Arraijan. And when you see it written in Spanish, it doesn't even resemble English, but really it means on the right hand. They just wrote it as they heard it, So
yeah. Oh, sorry, continue.
And it reminds me in Nicaragua too, on the Atlantic coast out there by Bluefields, they eat a soup. It's a seafood soup with a coconut base, and they call it rondon. But rondon really came from the English phrase run down. And the idea was that if you were run down or feeling tired, you would eat the soup and it would give you energy. So there's so many things like that may have an English background, but at first glance, it doesn't seem that way.
Yeah, one of our first weekends here in Panama City, we were going to hike Cerro Ancon, which is like the biggest hill in the city. But it was part of the Canal Zone. And so we were like walking up to the security guard, and the security guard is looking at us, and he's like, "Anconio?" And we're like, "Huh?" Like, because it was kind of uncertain of like where the path was. And he's like, "Anconio?" And then we're like, "Vamos a Cerro Ancon?" And he's like, "Okay, pasa. And then we realized he was saying Ancon Hill, but like Ancon Il in like the Panama accent.
Right. Yeah.
It's funny.
Yeah, I remember when we moved to Nicaragua, someone told me, I was looking for someone. They says, well, he lives right next to the Texaco. I'm thinking, Texaco? What on earth is Texaco? But that's how the Spanish pronounce Texaco, the Texaco gas station. So a lot of times there's words that we are familiar with in English, but we've never heard them pronounced with a Spanish accent. It can really throw you off in the beginning.
Yeah. And so is writing a Gringo guide about Mexico something that you're thinking about and working on?
Actually, that's exactly what I'm working on now. Just beginning the process, of filtering out the words. It's a bigger challenge to me because, of course, Mexico is so much larger than the countries in Central America, and each region has its own words and expressions. So I think it's going to be something a little bit more extensive than the books I've done so far. But
Yeah, I
definitely in
imagine.
7 years of living in Mexico, we've had to learn a lot of orale and andale and many other sayings that were not common in Central America.
Yeah, definitely. Or a huevo, what different food expressions.
Oh, yeah. But it is very interesting, to see how history does reflect itself in the Spanish of each of these countries. So in a way, by learning these words, not only are you communicating with them, but it's a way to indirectly learn about the history. Um, I thought it was interesting in Panama, they have a lot of words that are related to sports analogies because it's one of those countries that's a little bit more into baseball than soccer, because most of the Latin countries are more soccer based, but they like a lot of baseball there. So if you do something great, they may say la botaste, which is literally you hit it out, referring to a home run in baseball. Or to this day, if you're really good at something, they might say, tú eres de los Bravo de Boston. You're of the Boston Braves. And in investigating that, it turns out that the Boston Braves won the World Series all the way back in 1914. So I'm thinking, I cannot believe that expression has existed and persisted for more than 100 years in that country. And probably in the United States, people don't even remember who the Boston Braves were. So you just see the huge American influence from that time period still being present in their language today.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so for people who are like listening and maybe have got, they've got a lot of the basics of Spanish down, and they're planning a trip to a new country, one that maybe doesn't have a great gringo guide as a reference, like let's say they're going to Chile, Peru, or somewhere like that. How do you kind of like personally get ready and like once you are somewhere, like learn a bit more about how the local dialect's going to work? Is there anything you can do to prepare, and like what can you do to learn better?
Sure. I think right now the internet is a great source. I think if you would, Google Chilean Spanish, I'm sure there's some dictionaries that are available for that particular country, or you could Google common expressions in Chilean Spanish and find something that way. But what I would do, I would just start keeping a notebook. And every time I heard something I didn't understand, you can't be too proud to not ask, hey, what does that mean? I've never heard that word before, and write it down and try to use it yourself as soon as possible so that it becomes yours through repetition. I think basically that's the beginning point of learning it. And like I said, I do think there are a lot of references on the internet now of some of these terms. You just have to be careful because a lot of times on the internet, they don't tell you how formal or informal they can be, or if they're even vulgar. So just maybe consult with a good friend that is local to give you some guidance in those things.
Yeah, it's hard if you're like watching like Narcos Mexico and then you show up in Mexico City in like a professional setting. It might not work out that well.
That's exactly the case.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about that because I think that, at least for me personally, and I'm assuming that other people kind of feel like this, like sometimes there's this sort of like, oh, well, I'm like not a native speaker and I'm not a native person to this country. Like, is it okay for me to use these words? And I think that, sometimes it can feel really uncomfortable to adopt the local slang, especially when you're not entirely certain of like the right context to use it in. And so obviously like your guides are really great for that. But would your biggest recommendation just being like try to interact with locals and ask them those questions just so that you can feel more comfortable with it?
Definitely. On one-on-one conversations, if you say a word that's inappropriate, they're not going to be offended. They know it's not your native language. They know you're arriving to the country, and they start giving you the guidance. I remember one time, this is when I lived in Nicaragua, I was talking to a good friend in his office, and he tells me in Spanish, "Hablemos a calzón quitado." Now, that literally means let's talk with our underwear off. But it's just an idiomatic expression in Spanish that means, hey, let's just talk with our hair down. Let's just let everything out. We're talking in private. So in that conversation, I kind of learned, hey, this is a neat expression for, saying that let's talk openly or let's talk frankly. And then I remember later on, I was in a meeting with maybe 60 or 70 people, and I used that expression with everyone at that meeting, and they all looked at me, their faces turned red and purple. I said, "You can't say that in public." So sometimes, that gets away from us, but it always gives us something funny to talk about when we meet up again.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because when you said that, I feel like I would have been like, that's not the type of meeting I was in here. Like, what kind of meeting did you think this was? So yeah, that's a great example of just, learning from experience and, kind of figuring it out as you go. And I think that at least like my experience with the language has always been like, as long as I'm sort of apologetic with things and open to learning and hearing feedback, it seems like people are pretty forgiving, especially when they know that you're not a native speaker.
Definitely. And it actually creates stronger bonds with them because you're showing them that you're just human. You're not better than they are. You're on their level. I remember when we first visited Costa Rica, we have some good friends there. And they taught us a saying that it is, cuando no hay perro, con gato se montea. So this literally means when there's no dog, you can go hunting with a cat. But since my Spanish was not that sharp at the moment, I heard montarse instead of montear. So montarse means to ride on, doesn't mean to hunt. So when I repeated it, I said, si no hay perro, hasta se puede montar un gato. So if there's no dog, you can even ride a cat. And our friends, they died laughing when I said that. And this was over 20 years ago. But to this day, whenever we meet up with them, they always remind me of what I said. So it's kind of an inside joke between us. But even though it was a mistake, they view it as something endearing to them. And it's actually strengthened our friendship.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And has it been hard, like spending so long in Nicaragua, like when you shift to Mexico and have to learn these new expressions? Are you also trying to like learn the Mexican accent? Is that something that just kind of that you had happen unconsciously, or is that something you kind of consciously paid attention to trying to sound more Mexican?
Well, unfortunately, I always say I have factory accent. So even though I've been speaking Spanish for over 35 years, I still have a gringo accent. I don't think I have the good ear. I think people who are more musically inclined tend to be a little bit better with accents. But in general, only people that learned a language very young are usually able to even pass as natives with their speech. But definitely moving to Mexico almost felt like, a lot of times if you have a cell phone, when you get to another country, you have to buy a local chip and change the chips out of your phone. And practically, you have to do the same thing when you move from one Spanish country to another. I remember getting there. One of the sayings that they had in Nicaragua was echar la vaca, literally means to throw the cow. But Nicaraguans use it to mean to gang up on someone. Me están echando la vaca. They're ganging up on me. So I get to Mexico one day and says, hey, ¿por qué me están echando la vaca? Why are you all ganging up on me? But that's when they looked at me like I was from another planet. So then I had to, investigate all these new terms that I was hearing. Once again, looking to the internet, looking for dictionaries on Mexican Spanish, other works that have been produced until now. And then over time, you do start getting a little bit of their accent. They have a sing-song way of talking around Mexico City, like, ¿Cómo está, manto? Things like that. So then sometimes jokingly, you will use their same accent when you're talking to them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
There's something that we both really love about Mexican Spanish, and specifically in that area.
I remember, I think within like a month of just walking around Mexico City and hearing "No mami's way," like we're like, what is "No mami's way," man? Just hear it all over the place, and then you figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's amazing. It truly takes a lot of effort to now change the chip and learn all these local terms. I mean, hey, I was saying chele for a white person for 17 years, and now I had to learn to say güero, and then people were calling me güero too once I got to Mexico.
Yeah, I think it takes a lot of humility and a lot of like just reminding yourself what the goal is. Like the goal is to connect with people, because it's easy to kind of get in your head about like, I don't know, like, oh, I signed up, I was learning Spanish. Like someone told me you all spoke the same language.
Definitely. I think humility is a very important quality as you go from one country to another. We have to view the locals as our teachers in a way. We're the ones that are arriving in their country. And if we're willing to listen carefully and ask questions and be persistent over time, you will get there, just as you would learn any other new language. If you wanted to learn French or Italian or Japanese, but these are, major differences in dialects across countries that I think is important to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely agree with that. And so for you guys, you're back in the States. Are you settled in the States for the foreseeable future, or what's next for you in terms of, where you're going to be in the world?
I don't think so. We're just taking care of some health issues at this time, but we're hoping within the next 6 months to go back to Latin America. It may be anywhere from Mexico down to Panama. We're still not exactly sure. Probably, I'm guessing somewhere in northern Mexico, but it's still up in the air, I could say.
And then do you have any idea of when your Mexico guide will be out?
Hopefully sometime during this year, 2020, but I would think toward the later part of 2020.
Amazing. Well, we will make sure that there's links to all the other books that are out so far so people can go check those out. And if people want to learn more about you, Lee, where can they go to find you?
We're at gringoguide200.com. So if you go to the site, there's actually samples of each of the books in the form of 20 ways to speak Panamanian Spanish or 20 ways to speak Guatemalan Spanish. So if you check out those articles, that will give you a good idea what the book is about. And then you can think about checking us out. And if you do get any of the books, I would just ask the readers to give us a review on Amazon. So I think one of the difficulties of self-published authors is fewer than 100 people actually leave a review after they've bought a book. So it would be nice to get feedback about it and then move forward from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can speak from having the Panamanian one. It's been super helpful to be able to navigate the Panamanian colloquial slangs here, since they do have a lot of them. So thank you for creating that, Lee. And thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. This has been really fun.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, Ryan and Amanda.
Thanks, Lee.
Okay, have a good day.
To find more information, relevant links, and photos talked about in this week's episode, check out theworldwanderers.com.
If you have a question, comment, or feedback, send us an email at info@theworldwanderers.com. Join our community on Facebook at The World Wanderers or on Twitter at WorldWanderers1. As always, thanks so much for listening.
Have a great day.
Bye.